Hello all and welcome. We're going to wait just a moment or two to allow people to log in, and then we'll get started at a minute or two past the hour. Thanks. So good morning, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome all. Thank you for joining us today for this deep dive webinar on the Science Based Targets Initiative's Corporate Net Zero Standard. My name is Alwyn Smith, and I'm a Regional Manager for Net Zero campaigns at CDP, and I'm also part of the Science Based Targets Initiative's Corporate Engagement team, and I'm very happy to be the host for today's webinar. So I'll kick off with a few points of housekeeping, if we can advance to the next slide. The first point is that the session is being recorded. We will circulate the recording and the slides with attendees and registrants, and we will also make the recording available on the SBTi's YouTube channel. If you have questions throughout the session, please do submit them using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Questions are going to be addressed in writing. We have some colleagues from the SBTi team working in the background to answer your questions throughout the session, and we'll get through as many as they can. So on to the next slide then, and just to briefly introduce today's speakers, representatives of the SBTi core team. So I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Emma Watson, who is Senior Manager for Net Zero at the SBTi. And Emma was actually the person who led the project to develop the Net Zero standard that we're going to be discussing today. Then there's also Phoebe Holmes, and Phoebe is a target analyst with the SBTi. So Phoebe's role involves conducting assessments of companies' near-term and long-term science-based targets. So on to the next slide, and turning to look at the agenda for today. This is quite a deep and technical webinar, and following the launch event for the Net Zero standard, which took place back last October. Today is going to be a bit more about providing granular information. So as you can see, it is quite a packed agenda. To run through it, firstly, I will open with a high-level introduction to the Science Based Targets Initiative. And then I'm going to pass over to Emma, who will explain why and how the SBTi's Net Zero standard was developed. She's then going to provide an overview of what a science-based target is, diving into the key elements, and then followed by a deeper look into some of the methods and criteria, as well as advice for how to navigate sector-specific requirements included within the standard. Next then, Emma will briefly touch on the topic of, if we wouldn't mind, just next on the agenda, Emma will briefly touch on the topic of beyond value chain mitigation, providing a bit of an explanation of that. And then myself and Phoebe will walk you through the SBTi journey and what to expect right from the commitment stage through to the validation of a net zero target. And finally, we will wrap up by signposting to key net zero resources and some of the next steps connected to this project. So we're aiming to get through this agenda in about an hour and 20 minutes or so to give you all a few minutes back of your day. But there is a lot of information in there. So on to the next slide, and to open the first section now, I'm going to begin by providing a short introduction to the Science Based Targets Initiative for those of you who are less familiar with it. So the SBTi, as it's commonly known as, is an initiative that was founded just before the Paris Agreement as a collaboration between 4 founding partner organizations. And they are CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And the initiative was established really with the aim of driving ambitious corporate climate action by enabling companies to set emissions reductions targets that are based on science and consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so the SBTi's activities include defining and institutionalizing best practice when it comes to science-based target setting, and also providing a really wide range of target setting resources, guidance for both corporates and financial institutions. And crucially then, a key differentiating feature of the SBTi is that it also offers an independent assessment and validation service for companies' targets to ensure they are in line with its strict criteria, or the SBTi's strict criteria really, and demonstrating therefore that they're credible and robust. So on to the next slide, turning to look at what a science-based target is. Science-based targets provide a clearly defined pathway for companies and financial institutions to reduce their GHG emissions in line with what the latest climate science says we need if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So putting it simply, science-based targets help companies to determine how much and how fast they need to reduce their emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. Looking at the time frame of targets, then there are two kinds of targets. The first, as shown on the slide here, are near-term science-based targets. These span 5 to 10 years, and these are the kinds of targets which the SBTi first developed when it was set up back in 2015, and which companies have been setting since the inception. And the second type are longer-term or net zero science-based targets, and these are a relatively new kind of target, only having been launched late last year, and that's going to be the focus of this presentation. Just a final note on this slide then as well, as you'll see on point 3 here, it's important that companies, when setting both near-term and long-term net zero targets, are publicly disclosing their emissions on an annual basis throughout this target setting journey, so that they can provide transparency to stakeholders on their progress. So on to the next slide, and briefly touching on the progress that the SBTi has seen since it was begun. So since its inception, the SBTi has evolved from a really nascent project into really the de facto gold standard for target setting, and it's been embraced very widely among the climate change or climate action ecosystem. So we now have over 2,770 companies setting targets through the SBTi, which equates to over a quarter of global market capitalization. And we've seen particular momentum in the past year or 18 months. Within 2021, more companies joined the SBTi than had done in the entire period between 2015 and 2020. And we've really seen that momentum carry into this year too. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to Emma, who's going to discuss the development of the SBTi's net zero standard. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Owen, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today on this webinar. So we're going to start diving into some of the more technical details of the net zero standard, as Owen mentioned. But starting off, we're going to look at what net zero means at the global level. So what we can see here on this slide is a depiction of the state that we're in. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that greenhouse gas emissions are actually way over imbalanced by CO2 removals. And this is essentially, on a very high level, what is causing global climate change. Now, when we're looking at net zero scenarios at the global level, what we can see is that greenhouse gas emissions are extremely reduced, and they're then balanced by an increase in CO2 removals. So we need to reach this state by no later than 2050 if we want to limit global warming to 1.5C. So at the very high level, this is the global net zero picture that we're looking at and that we're trying to emulate with a company's science-based target, essentially breaking that down to a company level. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what we have seen is, and essentially why the Science Based Targets Initiative embarked on the process of developing the net zero standard. So the concept of net zero really came to the forefront when the IPCC released its special report on 1.5C back in October 2018. Since then, we saw a massive growth in the rate of adoption of net zero pledges. So what we can see on the screen here is that 88% of global emissions are actually covered by net zero pledges. So this data comes from the Energy Carbon Intelligence Unit, and they track all net zero pledges. We can also see the growth in the UNFCCC Race to Zero campaign on the right-hand side of the screen. So what this graph demonstrates is the amount of non-state actors, so it includes not only companies, but cities, regions, and other organizations that are committing to net zero through the Race to Zero campaign. And this is before COP26. So you can see that these numbers are growing exponentially over that time. And if you look a bit closer, what you can see is that the largest bucket within there, so the kind of bright purple in the middle, those are actually companies. So more and more companies are making net zero pledges over time. However, what we did begin to see was a huge amount of criticism of the concept of net zero because there was no robust benchmark. So companies and different other non-state actors were setting net zero targets, but there wasn't the kind of framework for them to do it. And so this led to a huge amount of criticism. Some of the top criticisms that we saw that we're trying to solve through the net zero standard development process was, first of all, that these targets had incomplete boundaries. So they may have been including only certain types of greenhouse gases, for example, only carbon dioxide, or they might have only been including their own operations or even specific products. Another key criticism of the concept of net zero was that it was allowing delayed action. So having a long-term target without interim milestones along the way didn't really hold these actors accountable for what they needed to do to actually reach net zero. The third and probably the biggest criticism of net zero targets had been that they allowed organizations to focus on offsetting instead of actually reducing their emissions. So they're essentially kicking the can down the road or using offsets instead of actually making those reductions themselves. And then finally, because there were no benchmarks available, there was a lack of scrutiny. It was very difficult to tell what was a credible net zero target. And there was no one checking whether these targets were in compliance with what the science was saying. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So because of these reasons, because of the science that we're seeing, that we are in a state of imbalance, but also the growing prominence of the concept of net zero, the SBTi embarked on this net zero standard development process. So you can learn more about this on our website. We have a webpage dedicated to this. But essentially, the process began back in September 2020, and that was when we launched the Net Zero Foundations paper. So this paper really spells out the key concepts for the work that we did on net zero. It's a very good read if you're still if you're interested in the theory behind net zero and the target setting approaches that companies could take. Following on from that, we then set up an expert advisory group. So this was a balanced group with lots of different viewpoints of 42 different individuals from business, academia, and science. So they really helped us to develop the criteria and the standard. Following on from that, we began to draft criteria, which went to public consultation at the beginning of last year, where nearly 400 participants took part in that consultation and provided an unprecedented amount of feedback to the SBTi. We used that feedback to refine the criteria, and we developed guidance to help companies to be able to implement that criteria themselves. That went to a company road test last summer, where 84 companies participated before going into a public consultation before launching in November. So really what we wanted to demonstrate with this slide is that there has been a huge amount of consultation that went into the net zero standard, lots of stakeholder input. So we had over 800 stakeholders that took part. So it was very much a collaboration of not just the SBTi, but lots of different stakeholders throughout the climate change community. So if we move on to the next slide, please, I'm going to walk you through what a science-based net zero target is under the SBTi's framework. So the first element of a company's net zero target is a near-term science-based target. So these are 5 to 10 year emission reduction targets in line with 1.5C pathways. So if you're familiar with science-based targets already, this is what we used to just simply call science-based targets, but we've added that specificity on. The next element of a company's net zero target, if we pop onto the next slide, is a long-term science-based target. So these targets essentially show companies how much they need to reduce emissions to be in line with global net zero scenarios that limit warming to 1.5C. Now, these targets are to be set for no later than 2050. In the power sector, that's by 2040, but for most companies, it's 2050. And as I mentioned, they show companies how much they need to reduce their emissions to be in line with global net zero. So for most companies, this is going to require them to reduce emissions by 90% or more. This does differ in the agricultural sector, where they would be required to reduce their emissions by 72% or more. So there's some slight sectoral differences. But for most companies in the kind of energy and industry side, they would be looking to reduce emissions by 90% or more. The third element is it's not a requirement, but it's a strong recommendation for companies to go beyond their science-based targets, to take action, make investments to mitigate emissions beyond their value chains. And we're going to go into this in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. So if you're familiar with carbon credits, this is essentially where this would fit in. So some examples of beyond value chain mitigation could be purchasing high quality jurisdictional REDD+ credits, or making direct investments in direct air capture and geological storage. So this bucket of mitigation is not just limited to carbon credits. It could be other types of investments too. And if we look at the fourth and final element of a company's net zero target, that would be the commitment to neutralize any emissions that remain. So as I mentioned previously, for most companies, they're going to be reducing their emissions by 90% or more. So some companies, they may have up to 10% of their emissions left when they reach their long-term science-based target. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the graph there. So the company is reducing their emissions significantly through their long-term science-based target. In this example, there are some emissions left. So the company is then required to neutralize those emissions with permanent carbon removals. So those are the four key elements that make up the net zero standard framework. Now, if we go into the next slide, please. So one of the commonly asked questions that we get at the Science Based Targets Initiative was how we came up with the figure of 90%. So really, what we looked at various different scenarios to come up with these figures. The International Energy Agency's net zero scenario was a very important reference for our work in this space. However, we did come up with a more holistic approach. We looked at other scenarios as well, like the IPCC. So you can find out more information on that in our Pathways to Net Zero technical summary, which is available on our website. So that goes into much more of the scientific detail. However, one thing that is really important to note is that we use some of the more low energy usage scenarios. So they essentially are the scenarios that require the least amount of carbon removal. And that's because they infringe least upon our sustainable development goals. So they have the least amount of risk to biodiversity, food security, water resources, and human rights. So that kind of explains a bit why we've gone for those kind of low to medium carbon removal scenarios within the work that we're doing. Great. Now, if we go on to the next slide, please. And another key question that we get is, when can a company claim that it has reached a state of net zero emissions? So really, this is when the company has reached its long-term science-based target, as explained in the previous slides, and then neutralized their emissions. So the first condition is science-based abatement. So the company should have reduced its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to either zero or a residual level that's consistent with 1.5C pathways that reach global net zero. The second condition is that any emissions that do remain are then neutralized at the net zero target date and thereafter. So a company would essentially have to have had that level of abatement and neutralization to be able to have claimed net zero. Fantastic, thank you. So now we're going to take a deep dive into the methods and criteria of the net zero standard. So when a company is setting their science-based targets, there's 4 different things that they need to take into account. The first thing that they need to think about is the time frame. So the near-term science-based target, as we've already explained, is a 5 to 10 year emission reduction target, and that's from the date of submission. So it's not from the base year, which is a question that we often get asked. As mentioned previously, the long-term science-based target is for 2050 latest, but as already mentioned, 2040 for the power sector. When we're looking at the ambition level of these targets, so here we're talking about what temperature goal the target needs to align to. So for near-term science-based targets, their scope 1 and 2 target should align with 1.5C, and their scope 3 target should align with well below 2C. In the long term, all targets need to align with 1.5C across all scopes. The third thing that a company needs to think about when they're setting their science-based target is the boundary. So how much of your greenhouse gas inventory needs to be covered by your science-based targets. So for near-term science-based targets, for scope 1 and 2, it's 95%. And for scope 3, if the company's scope 3 emissions make up over 40% of the then they need to include 2/3 or 67%. For the long-term science-based target, the coverage expands. So, well, for scope 1 and 2, it's the same, 95%. But for scope 3, companies, doesn't matter whether these scope 3 emissions are less intensive, all companies need to be including 90% of scope 3 emissions in their long-term target for that 2050 goal. Now we're going to go into these methods in a bit more detail, but we do have 6 methods that are available for target setting. There's one that is available in the near term that isn't available in the long term, and that is the engagement targets, the supplier or customer engagement targets. Otherwise, all methods can be used for both types of targets. Great. And we've touched on this in the last slide, but something just to highlight is that the SBTi's net zero standard does follow what we're calling an expansive boundary approach. So essentially what this means is that for near-term targets, companies only have to include 67% of their scope 3 emissions within the target, but in the long term, they need to be including 90% of their emissions. Now, the reason why we've taken this approach is that throughout the net zero standard development process, it was very clear that a comprehensive target was going to be necessary for companies to make credible net zero claims. They needed to be including the vast majority of their emissions, and that was very clear from our stakeholder feedback and from the research that we had done. However, we do recognize that there are huge amounts of challenges around scope 3, so data collation, changing supply chains. There's lots of different difficulties that come with scope 3, but there is a lot of innovation happening in this space, and we do expect that to improve over time. So we've taken this gradual increase in ambition so that companies can really focus on their most material emissions now, and there's more time to work through the complexity of scope 3, get the data right, get that understanding right over time. By the time that we are reaching that long-term science-based target, they will have had the opportunity to collaborate across the whole value chain. We need to work in collaboration with all stakeholders to be able to reach net zero. It's not something that a company can do in isolation. So this really provides them with the opportunity to engage with suppliers and customers to decarbonize. Great. And so diving a bit more into the science-based targets methods that we have available. So these two methods are available for all scopes. The first is the absolute reduction method. Now, if you've been familiar with science-based targets before, this is what we had previously been calling absolute contraction approach. We've simplified some of the terminology to try and make it easier for everyone to understand. But absolute reduction target setting methods essentially does what it says on the tin. So a company's emissions would be reduced by an absolute amount that is consistent with a cross-sector or sector-specific pathway. And we're going to talk about these cross-sector and sector-specific pathways in a bit more detail later on. The second method that is applicable for all scopes is the sector-specific intensity convergence approach. So essentially, emission intensity targets are calculated, they're done on an emissions intensity basis. So that could be emissions per ton of steel, emissions per kilowatt hour, using a metric like that. So essentially, the concept is that all companies within a specific sector, their emissions intensity would converge when we reach 2050 or sooner. So there's various different sectors that we have these methods for. Power generation, cement, iron and steel, transport sectors, buildings and agricultural commodities. And a lot of these methods are available for well below 2C scenarios at the moment, and we are updating those. So I'll go into a bit more detail in a second. Great. So if we look at some of the other methods that we have available, so these ones are eligible for specific scopes only. So the scope 2 target, the renewable electricity method is only applicable to scope 2. So in these targets, companies would actively procure at least 80% renewable electricity by 2025 and 100% renewable electricity by 2030. So it doesn't necessarily matter where a company is beginning with these targets. We do get a lot of questions about whether the base year impacts the renewable electricity targets. But really what we need to be looking for is that in 2025, 80% of your electricity is from renewable sources and 100% by 2030. So that doesn't matter in this case. Then we have 3 methods that are only applicable to scope 3. So the first 2 are very similar. We have the scope 3 economic intensity reduction approach and scope 3 physical intensity reduction approach. So in both of these methods, the emissions intensity would be reduced by an amount that's consistent with well below 2C and 1.5C for long-term targets. And in both of these methods, the economic or physical intensity would be reduced by 7% year on year, or in the long term, reduced by 97% overall. For near-term science-based targets, we have a method that's only available for them, which is the engagement target. So this is a very popular and practical target setting method for companies to take, where actually they would set a target for either suppliers or customers representing a certain percentage of their emissions to set their own science-based targets. So we've got an example there that suppliers representing X percent of scope 3 emissions would set science-based targets by 2027, for example. So that's a really popular type of target setting method because it allows a bit more flexibility in terms of understanding your scope 3 footprint, which you may not have all the data for, but it's relatively easy to understand. You know, you look at the suppliers that you work with and you can see, okay, X percent of them have science-based targets now. By 2027, we'd like this many percentage of our suppliers to have targets. So that also allows a bit more it's a bit more of a practical metric for companies to look at. Great. And if we go on to the next slide, please. So when we're looking at what data is required to model net zero targets, it is actually relatively simple. So first of all, I should mention that we have a net zero tool. So that tool is separate from the SBTi tool. And that is available on our website. So you can download that and use that to set your targets. The information that you would need would be your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions inventory. So we would recommend that companies look to the greenhouse gas protocol for calculating their emissions inventory. If you're just starting out with your scope 3 footprint, we might recommend you use a scope 3 screening approach in the first instance. The SBTi does not necessarily provide specific guidance on greenhouse gas accounting. However, within our guidance and criteria, we do have certain sector-specific guidance for companies. So please look out for that as well. But so going back, you need to have your inventory. And if you're modeling multiple targets, you may want that broken down by different activities or sectors. So for example, if I were working in the building sector, I might have a large proportion of my emissions associated with the buildings themselves, cement, steel, and then perhaps the rest is a mixed bag. So you may want to set targets on those 4 different emission sources. So there's different ways that companies can cut their emissions footprint depending on how they'd like to set their science-based targets. We would recommend that companies don't overcomplicate it and look at very granular, but only break it down when it's very significant amounts of greenhouse gases that we're thinking about in that activity or sector. The next thing that you would need to know is your base year. So the base year should be 2015 at the earliest, and we recommend that that would be a year that is representative of your typical emissions footprint. So the impacts from COVID are something that should be taken into account when selecting your base year. And then if you're setting an intensity target, you would also need to know your base year output. So for example, if I'm setting targets on emissions per ton of steel, I would obviously need to know the tons of steel that the company would output in its base year. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a couple of screenshots of the net zero tool. So at the top, you can see the data input tab for using the absolute method, and it's fairly simple. So you just put in your whether the target covers scopes 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, scope 1 only, the method that you're using, your base year, your target year, the pathway that you're choosing, and then your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So that is fairly simple, and then outputs the target. At the bottom, you can see that there's the intensity method data input tab. It's pretty much the same. The only thing that's different is that you would also include your base year output, so those tons of steel, for example. Fantastic. Okay. So now we're going to look a bit more into sector-specific guidelines. So within the SBTi, we have various projects ongoing to look at different sectors. So this information can all be found on our website. If you look at our website at the top right-hand side, you'll see we have a link to this sector page, and this lists out all of the different work that we're doing around different sectors. One thing that you'll notice perhaps on this slide is that a lot of these pathways are under development. So we have previously done a lot of the sector specific work based on well below 2 degrees scenarios. The SBTi is actually moving as a whole, as of July this year, to 1.5C targets only for scope 1 and 2. So because of this transition that we're undergoing, the SBTi is updating many of the pathways that we previously had available. So you can see these on the screen as denoted by the yellow stars. And the yellow stars also have dates as to when you can expect these pathways to be updated. One thing also to note from this table is that it separates the pathways from the guidance. So sometimes the SBTi will update our tools and release pathways for companies to actually set targets. So you can input your data, you can set targets, but there may not be a guidance document that sits alongside that. So we don't always publish the two at the same time, or we don't always publish guidance documents alongside pathways. So you might notice that some of the dates may not match up for the guidance and pathways. So a couple of things to note here. So the oil and gas sector is one that we get a lot of questions about. So the SBTi is undertaking a process to develop an oil and gas pathway. This project has been going on for quite a while now, and it's undergoing an external review. So we don't have a time frame for that to come out. And unfortunately, at the moment, we can't accept commitments or validate targets for companies in these sectors. So we would ask companies to keep up to date with the sector page on our website for oil and gas to find out more about that sector. Something else to note, and we'll go into this in more detail in the next slide, is that companies in the forest, land and agricultural sector, that's the AFOLU sector up at the top left-hand side in orange. And so those sectors and the power sector are required to use their sector-specific pathways. All other sectors actually have the option of either using their specific sector pathways or using the cross-sector pathway. And the cross-sector pathway I mentioned earlier is a universal pathway that it's a kind of global pathway that all companies can use, apart from those in forest, land and agriculture and the power sector. So hopefully these timelines are useful for you if you do operate in these sectors. We do actually have more specific guidance on a sector basis within the Net Zero Standard. So that's Chapter 8 within the Net Zero Standard. And the title of that chapter is Sector Guidance for Long-Term Science-Based Targets. So that basically is a table that lays out any specific greenhouse gas accounting requirements or target setting requirements that come for those sectors. Fantastic. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what we see here is a flowchart that should help companies to understand whether they need to use the cross-sector pathway or the sector-specific pathway for their long-term science-based targets. So first of all, what the company needs to understand is whether they operate in or have significant emissions allocated to any of the sectors that we do actually have specific sector pathways for. So if we kind of just take it from the left-hand side of the screen, so if you do have significant emissions from the forest, land and agricultural sector, the first question that you would need to ask is whether your company had significant forestry emissions. The reason why that is because companies in the forestry sector, so those producing timber or wood fibre, they would be required to use their sector-specific pathway. However, this is not currently available, and that's something that the SBTi is still working on. So at the moment, companies can't set net zero targets on forestry emissions. The next, if you don't have significant forestry emissions, then you should use the land and agricultural absolute pathway, or you could use the agricultural commodity pathway. So those are the intensity pathways. Those aren't yet available. They'll be available in June, the commodity pathways. So on the next slide, we'll talk a bit more about the forest, land and agricultural sector timelines, as that project is currently under development. So next, if your company, if we're looking at the purple buckets, if your company's in the power sector, you must use the power sector pathway. That companies in those sectors don't have the option. The next bucket to kind of think about in blue is if your company had significant emissions from any of the following sectors. So buildings, iron and steel, cement, maritime transport, aviation. So those companies actually have the option of either using the cross-sector pathway, so universal pathway, or they could use the sector-specific intensity or absolute methods. Now, it might seem strange that these companies could use either option of targets. And it could be especially strange because sometimes the sector-specific pathways actually require greater reductions than the cross-sector pathway, which requires the 90% reduction. So the reason why companies can do this is because the difference is relatively small. So it's going to be less than 10% and generally much less than 10%. And also because companies, when they reach their long-term science-based target, they'll be required to neutralize any emissions that remain. So the aim of that is that it would counteract the impact of those residual emissions, but it would also incentivize the company to continue to reduce their value chain emissions as well. Finally, if none of these sectors apply to your company or you have a very varied Scope 3 footprint, we would encourage you to use the cross-sector pathway. So that's probably the most simple option. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the forest, land and agricultural sector. So this is a project, as I mentioned, the Forest, Land and Agricultural, or FLAG project, that has been ongoing and is due for release in June 2022. So as I mentioned previously, forestry long-term science-based targets pathways aren't yet available. So we cannot offer targets to those companies yet. However, companies outside of the forestry sector, but in the agricultural sector, do have the options below. So first of all, it's really important to say that, of course, having a greenhouse gas inventory is going to be a prerequisite to target setting. So the first thing that a company with emissions that are applicable in these sectors needs to do is to set their greenhouse gas inventory. Now, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is currently undertaking a process to develop guidance for this sector. So many companies have been waiting for this, and they're really excited for this to come out. However, there are some guidance documents that we do recommend that companies can look at now in advance of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol release. So if you are interested in those, I would take a look at Table 5 in the draft FLAG guidance, which is available on our website. So companies can get started, or at least kind of get a better understanding through looking at those guidance documents. So there's essentially three pathways that a company could follow, and three different situations that they might be in, and to understand how they should approach setting FLAG targets. So we'll just kind of go through them all. So if you're a FLAG company that does not already have validated science-based targets, so they would then either be setting near-term science-based targets or setting near-term and net zero targets. So from now until June, we would recommend that you wait until the FLAG guidance is released. After June is the interim period when FLAG tools and guidance are available. So from June until March 2023, we do encourage that companies have they look to creating their greenhouse gas inventories and setting FLAG targets. However, it wouldn't be a requirement. From April 2023 onwards, companies will be required to set FLAG targets. This is assuming that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol draft would be released in April 2023, because we do have a lot of companies that are keenly waiting on that. So there is a dependence on that, but this is the timelines that we're working for requirements at the moment. For FLAG companies that already have validated science-based targets, but they're looking to add net zero targets, so we would recommend that you wait until June. Now, the reason why that is because we want companies to set near-term science-based targets for FLAG as well as net zero targets. If you do not set near-term FLAG targets by, I guess, through June to March, these companies would actually be required to come back to set a flag target by the end of 2023. So by waiting for the flag guidance to come out, you're actually going to save yourself a lot of time and resource through going through the validation process by setting both the near-term and the long-term targets in one go. After April 2023, all companies would be required to set their flag targets, just the same as the companies that didn't have validated SBTs. So hopefully this is helpful for companies that are interested in the forest, land and agricultural sector. Great. So now we're going to move on to go a bit deeper into the beyond value chain mitigation piece. So beyond value chain mitigation is essentially a new term that came out around about the time of the launch of the Net Zero Standard. Previously, we had been using the term compensation. So it's a new one for many people to get their heads around. So what we wanted to do here was to explain some of the terminology that we use within the science-based targets to hopefully give a better understanding of how it all fits together. So first of all, we have the term mitigation. So mitigation is the term for any human intervention to reduce emissions or enhance sinks of greenhouse gas emissions. So what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, so this is a Venn diagram, and essentially mitigation captures all of these actions that humans would take. Abatement is a term that we use to identify the measures that companies take to prevent, reduce, or eliminate sources of greenhouse gas emissions within their value chain. So some examples of that would be reducing energy use, switching to renewable energy. So it's anything that a company does within its value chain, and essentially that's its science-based targets is the abatement. Beyond value chain mitigation, so if we think back to the 4 elements of a net zero target, this was element number 3. So these are the mitigation actions or investments that fall outside of a company's value chain. And they can be actions that either avoid or reduce emissions or that remove and store. So it's not limited to removals, and it's not limited to avoid/reduce emission reductions. We have the term compensation here just for reference, but we are phasing that out. However, this was a term to describe actions that companies would take to avoid or reduce emissions outside of their value chain. So noting here that it didn't include removals. And finally, the last term is the term neutralization. So thinking back again to the 4 elements of a net zero target. So neutralization was that 4th element. And essentially, it's the measures that a company takes to remove carbon from the atmosphere and permanently store it to counterbalance the impact of any emissions that remain. So the counterbalancing part of that definition is quite important. Neutralization can happen within or beyond the value chain. It depends on kind of how that's happening as to where, but there is that flexibility on that. Great. So that's a description of the terms that we use. And when the net zero standard was developed, it was developed with the mitigation hierarchy in mind. So that's another term that we often use within the net zero standard and the net zero foundations paper. And what this means is that the most important piece of a company's climate strategy should be focused on abatement, or climate targets, sorry, should be focused on abatement. So that's looking at reducing emissions within their own value chain, essentially walking the walk. The next piece is the beyond value chain mitigation. So if you've measured your greenhouse gas emissions, you're reducing them in line with science. The next thing to do would be to look beyond your value chain and see how you can mitigate emissions to contribute to global societal net zero goals. And then finally, the neutralization piece. So that is more of a long-term goal, and hence why smaller, and a company should have abated the vast majority of its emissions before neutralizing. So that comes last within the mitigation hierarchy. This is in comparison to common practice where beyond value chain mitigation or offsetting would be used to balance emissions and not thinking about the abatement piece first. Great. So the next slide, please. So this slide essentially shows some examples of the different actions that a company could take that would fit within these different buckets. So this slide is split into actions that reduce emissions and actions that remove emissions. So going back to the emission reductions, so abatement, it happens within the value chain. So ways that companies could do this would be through new technologies, through switching to renewable energy, or through more sustainable transport. Outside the value chain, they could be helping to prevent deforestation or providing direct finance to projects or technologies. So these actions would all fit within that beyond value chain mitigation piece. Then if we're thinking about removals, so again, removals can happen within or beyond the value chain. Some examples of this could be direct air capture and storage, enhanced weathering, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, afforestation, coastal blue carbon, and then a variety of other approaches. So removals, depending on whether they're used to counterbalance remaining emissions, that would then contribute towards neutralization. Or if we are purchasing removals now, that would count to the beyond value chain mitigation piece. So it does depend on how and when a company is using removals as to what bucket essentially of mitigation they fit within. One thing to note is that the net zero standard criteria is fairly light at the moment on criteria around removals. The reason why that is because we do require that removals are permanent. However, the frameworks for assessing CO2 removal permanence, they're still relatively immature, and we want to make sure that we're very well informed on that piece. So those criteria will be developing over time, so watch this space for that. But for the moment, we do expect that neutralization piece will come further in the future. So we'll be providing more guidance in due course. Fantastic, cool. And so what role do carbon credits play within the net zero standards? This is a question that we are commonly asked. So first of all, they play a role within the transition to net zero. So that's from now onwards. Companies can choose to purchase carbon credits while they transition to a state of net zero. So that's in addition to the science-based abatement of their value chain emissions. And that is to support society to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Then at net zero, companies with residual emissions in their value chain are expected to neutralize those emissions with removals, and those can be sourced through carbon credits. So this information actually comes from our Beyond Value Chain Mitigation FAQ, which is available on our website. So you can find out more about this and the work that we're doing ongoing on our website and through the FAQ. Great. If we go on to the next slide, please. Yes, so I'm now going to hand over to Owen and Phoebe, who are going to walk you through the SBTi journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, for those great insights. As Emma mentioned, we'll now turn to look at what the journey of setting a science-based target could look like for your company. I'll begin by providing an overview of the commitment stage, which is the first step which most organizations choose to take. So firstly, to consider which route your organization should take depending on the type of organization it is. For large companies, as shown here, these are companies with over 500 employees. They should follow the standard SBTi commitment and target setting journey, which I will go through in detail in the next slide. Then for SMEs, small and medium enterprises, the SBTi offers a simplified and streamlined route for setting targets, whereby the commitment stage is actually bypassed and companies just directly set a predefined target. And Phoebe is going to elaborate on that further. Just for a definition of SMEs there, we say that any company that's an independent non-subsidiary with less than 500 employees is considered an SME. And then finally, looking at financial institutions. So currently financial institutions can make a commitment to set a net zero target via the SBTi. However, the net zero target validation service for them has not yet commenced because the net zero standard for financial institutions is still under development. That's expected in Q1 2023. But in the meantime, financial institutions can already have near-term targets validated, and we would encourage them to do so. So on to the next slide now, where I'll provide an overview of the SBTi journey. As mentioned, this is appropriate for companies that are at least 500 employees. So the first step is the commitment. And this is where an organization signs the SBTi's commitment letter, thereby publicly declaring an intention to set an SBT, I should say. The organization's name is then going to appear on the SBTi's website, and it will be marked as committed. This stage isn't obligatory, but most companies do choose to make this commitment because it provides a very strong signal to your stakeholders regarding the intention to set a target. And when signing a commitment letter, companies can choose whether to make a commitment just to set a near-term target or whether to also set a net zero target. Then the next stage, it's developing. So after committing to set a target, an organization then has a period of up to 24 months or 2 years to model and develop the target. Many companies don't require this full time period, but that's the maximum allocated time frame. Then thirdly, we have the submission, and this is perhaps most importantly, this is when you have developed your target and you need to submit it to the Science Based Targets Initiative for validation. And this is also, I think, a key distinguishing feature really of the SBTi when you compare it to some other climate commitment initiatives, because under the SBTi's model, the company is going to have its targets assessed by a team of technical analysts like Phoebe and her colleagues to ensure that it meets the SBTi strict criteria. So that really lends a lot of credibility to the target. And we're going to hear more about the validation process from Phoebe later on. Next, it's communicating the target. So once the target's been validated, assuming it receives approval, then the SBTi's website will be updated to show that this company now has a target set, and the target itself will be communicated there for transparency to stakeholders. And then finally, disclosure. So this is, of course, after the target is set and communicated, where the real work starts in actually needing to reduce emissions, and companies are also required then to report on an annual basis their emissions inventory so that it's easy to track progress against targets. So on to the next slide then. And to give a quick call to action. So we're delighted to say that almost 1,000 companies have already made a commitment to setting a net zero target via the SBTi. And as I mentioned, companies can make this commitment by signing the SBTi's commitment letter, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slide here. There is an option within that letter which you can select to set a net zero target. So that's what you should do if you're going to make this leadership net zero commitment. Companies that are already part of the Science Based Targets Initiative, either with a near-term target approved or with a near-term commitment, are also encouraged to make this additional net zero commitment. They can do so by submitting the letter and checking that box as shown. And just also one other note, for any companies which might be on the line that made a net zero commitment prior to the opening of the net zero target validation service in January this year, they will need to submit a net zero target for validation to the SBTi before January 2024, because that's the 24-month window I mentioned. So on to the next slide then, and finally within this commitment section, I'm just going to provide a quick insight into the Race to Zero and the SBTi's relationship to that. So the Race to Zero is a UN-backed global umbrella campaign which brings together actors, non-state actors of various types, so including companies, cities, regions, financial and educational institutions. And it brings them together to make these robust net zero commitments to no later than 2050, and also a commitment to reduce emissions in the immediate term before 2030. And the Science Based Targets Initiative has had the kind of primary entry route for most large companies into the Race to Zero to date. So all companies which joined the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign between 2019 and COP26 last year are part of the Race to Zero. And now any companies that have been making net zero commitments over the past few months and that continue to do so will also become part of this UN-backed Race to Zero campaign. So we encourage your company to make that commitment if you haven't already done so. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Phoebe, who will talk you through the next stage of the journey on target validation.
Thank you, Olwen. So as mentioned, in this section, I'll be providing some clarity on the process and requirements of the SBTi's net zero target validation. So we can see here, these steps are essentially a very high-level summary of the process companies will need to take in order to get themselves ready for getting a net zero target validated by SBTi. Now, firstly, regardless of whether your company has previously gotten SBTi targets validated, you should carefully determine what type of validation service would be most appropriate for your company's situation. The options being a net zero submission only, or a package submission, which covers both near-term and long-term net zero targets. Second, you should prepare the documents needed for net zero validation. And finally, once your company has filled out all the required documents and forms, you should make a booking in the SBTi online target booking system to secure your date for net zero validation. Next slide, please. So after the release of the groundbreaking net zero standard, the SBTi expanded its service offerings to include validation for both near and long-term targets. And as mentioned, there are two main types of net zero validation options: net zero submissions and net zero package submissions. And both of these options are based on a 60 business day validation turnaround from the start of the contract. So if your company already has SBTi validated near-term targets that are aligned with the SBTi net zero criteria and you don't wish to update your near-term targets, you can pursue a regular net zero submission. This option is only for companies that need to get their long-term targets validated. Alternatively, if your company does not yet have near-term targets validated by SBTi or needs to update its near-term targets in order to meet the net zero criteria, you will pursue the net zero package submission option. Next slide, please. So there are a few key things to keep in mind when preparing your company's net zero submission. In particular, for companies that have already had SBTi targets validated, the base year greenhouse gas inventory you submitted several years ago may no longer be accurate due to structural changes, enhanced data quality, sectoral developments, etc. And for companies who need additional guidance on whether they do need to update or resubmit their near-term targets, we highly recommend consulting the Net Zero Getting Started guide. So once you've read through the guide, you'll be able to appropriately assess whether you will need to also provide the near-term target update form. And lastly, you should also make sure to consider the relationship between your company's near and long-term targets. Your near-term targets should be designed to help your company reach the 90% ambition and coverage threshold required by the SBTi Net Zero standard through gradually tackling your company's most pressing emissions hotspots. And further to these, you should also select consistent KPIs for monitoring progress against both your near and long-term targets so that you can assess whether or not your company is on track to meet its net zero goals. Next slide, please. So these points are really just to reiterate some of the tips highlighted on the last slide. Now, when assessing whether you will need to re-baseline and recalculate your near-term targets, these are the key things to keep in mind. Please consider whether your company has near-term targets that meet the net zero criteria. So for instance, a lot of companies that got validated in the past have set well below 2C aligned near-term targets and will now need to update the ambition of their near-term targets to be 1.5C aligned. Or perhaps your company had a base year prior to 2015, and now in order to align with the net zero standard, you'll need to select a base year of 2015 or later. Please also note that the SBTi has implemented a 5% significance threshold. So this means that if your company's total emissions inventory changes by 5% or greater, for example, from structural changes to the company, changes in the accounting methodology, or improvements in data quality, you will be required to re-baseline and recalculate your targets. For that reason, it is really important to ensure that your company's base year inventory is up to date. And once again, I would urge you to review the Net Zero Getting Started guide. The flowchart on pages 13, 14, and 15 is especially useful in helping companies determine whether they are ready for net zero validation. Next slide, please. So now we'll cover the documents needed for net zero validation. So the first document required is the net zero submission form, which is in Word format. This is the core document that will house information about your company, its business activities, its emissions profile, the near and long-term targets, any past net zero claims, as well as strategies for neutralization or beyond value chain mitigation. The second form required is the Net Zero Excel supplement. You will use the supplement to report your company's full greenhouse gas inventory for the base year and most recent year, any inventory exclusions, and also to record long-term target coverage. The Excel supplement is meant to help store all of the quantitative information needed for the validation, and also to help your company perform the basic checks needed to ensure the target coverage and exclusions are in alignment with the net zero criteria. And then lastly, you should also submit the net zero tool that was explained earlier by Emma. Please keep in mind here that the SBTi net zero tool is separate from the near-term target setting tool that you may be familiar with, and that all long-term targets are to be modeled using the net zero tool only. And once again, all of these documents can be found on the SBTi website under the Set a Target section. Next slide, please. So the last step in preparing for net zero validation is, of course, to book a slot using the SBTi's online target booking system. The booking system includes a set of pre-screening questions, as well as a place to upload all required information and documents and to input payment information. Also, please don't panic if the next available slot for validation is several months away. We at the Target Validation team are continuing to expand capacity, and we have already managed to move bookings up by several months since the opening of the Net Zero Validation service in January. Next slide, please. So for SMEs, contrastingly to near-term targets, which are only required to cover scopes 1 and 2, net zero targets must also encompass 1.5C aligned long-term targets. And crucially, these long-term targets should encompass emissions reductions across all 3 scopes. And there should also be a commitment to neutralize any residual emissions that companies are unable to abate. As was mentioned earlier, SMEs submit targets through an expedited validation route in which they simultaneously commit to and set science-based near-term and long-term net zero targets. SMEs can submit their targets through a specific SME target validation application. The steps for doing so are listed here on the bottom right of the screen. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you've compiled the documents required for validation, it is really important to ensure you understand the SBTi's communications framework. Over recent months, the SBTi has developed communications guidelines to help companies accurately disclose their net zero commitments and targets, and to provide clear expectations on how companies should frame their SBTi validated targets. Now, we recognise that a lot of companies might have pre-existing claims surrounding net zero or carbon neutrality, which may not necessarily be aligned with the SBTi's net zero standard. And because of this, we have included detailed information in the guidelines on the do's and the don'ts of communicating SBTi validated net zero targets. So in this table, there are some examples of common net zero claims we see from companies which do not meet the SBTi net zero standard criteria, and some suggestions of ways to reframe those claims so that they comply with the standard. So if we look at these examples listed in the table, for instance, rather than claiming your company has already achieved net zero as a result of offsetting, we would require companies to highlight that they have set net zero targets that lead to direct reductions across their value chain, and that any additional investments resulting in emissions avoidance or carbon removals are part of their beyond value chain mitigation activities. Similarly, instead of claiming a state of net zero after achieving 90% reductions within your company's own operations, so within scopes 1 and 2, we ask that companies make clear that SBTi approved net zero claims relate to 90% emissions reductions across scopes 1, 2, and 3, as well as the permanent neutralization of residual emissions. And then finally, it is also important to ensure that achievement of any near-term targets within a company's net zero package submission essentially act as milestones in a company's pathway to net zero, and that achieving these near-term targets do not mean that a company has already reached net zero. Okay, so thank you. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Olwen.
Many thanks, Phoebe, for walking us through that process, really helpful. So I'm now going to briefly talk about the next steps that the SBTi is going to focus on after the development of this standard, as well as walking you through and signposting you to a couple of key resources. So on to the next slide and turning to look at those resources first. So there's 4 central resources, and I think they have already been referred to a certain amount by both Emma and Phoebe, but just to give you an overview of what they are. The first is this Getting Started guide, and this is quite a simple and visual guide to the net zero standard. It's got helpful flowcharts so that you can understand based on your own company's situation what your next steps need to be. Then there's the net zero standard document itself. This is a more comprehensive document. It includes the criteria, but also really helpful guidance along along that target setting journey. Then there's the criteria, so that's just the key criteria against which companies' net zero targets would be assessed. And finally, the net zero tool, which can be used, as Emma described, to model your long-term science-based targets. So all of those resources can be found on the SBTi's website on the Net Zero tab and within the resources section below. There's also some additional resources that have been developed, including a high-level 2-page summary of the standard, as well as FAQ videos, which are available on the SBTi's YouTube channel, and some blog posts also on the SBTi website. So on the next slide as well, just to keep with the summary of resources, and these 2 are for those of you more interested in delving deeper into the technical side of things. So I believe Emma did touch on both of them earlier, but as a recap, the foundations paper outlines the theory behind net zero and lays out the principles and kind of conceptual foundations which made up the basis of this standard. And then the pathways to net zero, this is going into quite scientific detail. It was produced in collaboration with a number of academics and IPCC lead authors and mitigation experts. So it's kind of a technical summary providing this overview of the SBTi's process for selecting the mitigation pathways. On to the next slide then, and here we have a summary of 3 pillars of kind of projects that the SBTi identified as needing further development when the net zero standard was released late last year. So as Emma went into in quite a bit of depth, this beyond value chain mitigation piece, obviously there's still some uncertainty around that. It's a very fast evolving landscape. And so the SBTi is going to continue to do work in that area and will at some point provide further guidance on the neutralization and on the beyond value chain mitigation pieces. Then we have net zero value chains. So I think most are probably well aware, and the SBTi acknowledges that there are particular complexities when it comes to scope 3 target setting. And so for that reason, the initiative is in the early stages of developing a project which will focus on value chains, looking at temperature alignment for scope 3, answering some key questions on value chain interventions like insetting, and looking at new methods to drive value chain alignment. Then last but not least, there is the Measurement, Reporting and Verification, or MRV project. So this is currently well underway. The SBTi is working on the development of a framework which is planned to be launched by the end of this year, 2022, which aims to provide a standardized and more robust mechanism to track organizations' progress against science-based targets. And so the SBTi will appoint an expert advisory group with a diverse range of relevant specialists from across different stakeholder types. And that group will help with the kind of final input to the project, and we'll also probably have a public consultation. So do look out for more information on that in the coming weeks and months. So with that, I'll go on to the last slide, and it's just to wrap things up. And really just to say, firstly, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Big thank you to the presenters, Emma and Phoebe. A lot of very detailed and hopefully helpful information was shared. So I would imagine many of the audience may need to spend some time to digest it, and we'd recommend that you do use all of the resources that are available and that were signposted, as well as using the recording, which will be made available online and shared with you. On the question side, so we've actually got hundreds of questions in throughout today's session, and the team has been working hard in the background to address them, and quite about half of them have been addressed, but there are some that remain outstanding. And so the SBTi over the coming weeks and months is going to continue to provide resources which address frequently asked questions, particularly on some of the topics that we see most questions arising from. So we will share those with you once they're developed. So many thanks again for joining today's webinar. We hope you found it helpful and enjoy the rest of your day.